So I'm Les Levidow, Senior Research Fellow in Development Policy and Practice within SSGS. The project is entitled Community-Led Policy Innovation for Local Food Growing, with an emphasis on participatory research methods, the theme of this overall session. So I'll speak firstly to give an overview of the results in barely 10 minutes to allow time for a particular case that follows within that project, and then switch to a different part of the world, South America, for another project which I ran a few years ago. So, as the national context for our project, community food growing, henceforth CFG, means a cooperative effort in community gardens, shared allotments, or city farms. These initiatives build skills for sustainable food growing, cooperative practices, wider community outreach, and policy support, which is the focus here. How this happens? Well, in many places there is a borough-wide advocacy group which manages or facilitates such initiatives, brings them together for knowledge exchange, and pursues more helpful support measures from their local authority on behalf of all the initiatives. Many such groups have adopted the name Incredible Edible, such as the one in Reading. And that name, in turn, comes from the nationwide network, which has a nationwide campaign for easier access to urban land for food growing. Now, our project had many aims, especially these three, to keep it short. So to engage local authorities by clarifying and requesting more helpful support measures for community food growing, to articulate community-driven policy innovation, as in the title of our project, aiming to strengthen collective capacities, and more widely to increase the resources for local food growing and short chain distribution. So helpful support measures can be classified in two kind of categories. One is requests for tangible support, access to suitable growing spaces with long-term tenure beyond simply meanwhile or temporary spaces, liability insurance, various materials, and free services as listed there. Perhaps less tangibly, but in some sense more important, is the demand for more horizontal or collaborative governance arrangements, in particular capacity building for organizational skills, community outreach, and policy engagement, so as to create a collaborative development of the support measures with the local authority, not just top-down services. Now, our project brought together 5 borough-wide advocacy groups whose logos are here, and we developed or adapted methods of participatory action research, which is indicated by this diagram. If you look on the left-hand side, basically it means a collective actor of some kind identifies a problem that they face, plans action to address that problem, carries out the action, observes the outcomes of that action, reflects on those outcomes and the reasons why perhaps the action was more or less successful or not successful in order to plan the next cycle along similar lines. So in this way, researchers and participants work together to understand a problematic situation and learn how to improve it. The collective actor means a group that already exists or is newly created, which can act as a collective subject and learner. A group becomes a more effective change agent through this learning process. Now, in our project, these 5 borough-wide advocacy groups kept reflective diaries, and that means the case study leader in particular, but in discussion with others involved in their group. They regularly exchange their experiences in our monthly meetings and so broaden their intervention strategies. The OU team facilitated the discussions among the case study leaders and often posed questions to sharpen the analysis of their experiences. And there I list the members of the team. We synthesized the various group practices into a pattern whereby they were encountering obstacles of many kinds and then finding ways to overcome or bypass the obstacles. That is really a commonplace within participatory action research, because it's by confronting the obstacles that one understands better the context that must be changed. And this, perhaps somewhat simplistically, lists some obstacles and means to bypass or overcome them. So I'll just go through these quickly. The council provides little access or secure tenure for food growing spaces. So these groups request land access still from the council, but beyond the council from other institutions, which may also provide material support. And that has been successful with some schools, churches, a hospital, and even a railway station. Narrow deliverables. The council provides narrow material things, such as planters and raised beds, almost as if they were simply delivering targets, which in some cases they are. So the groups demand also provision of crucial services, such as water supply, green waste disposal, as well as skills training. Harmful practices. The grounds maintenance staff tidy up landscapes, thus destroying or undermining biodiversity. So the group engages the council staff in an educational process on why the biodiversity is good and necessary in order to conserve those resources. Devise of support. The community food growing groups compete for small grants, thus dividing them from each other and increasing their organizational burdens, both to apply for the funds and, if successful, to administer them. So the groups ask the council to create a common supply of essential items and distribute them free of charge to such initiatives. Responsibility for community food growing remains ambiguous among the council units because it doesn't fall in any obvious place, partly because it brings so many societal benefits. So the groups pitch community food growing for its relevance to specific policies as an entry point to relevant council officers. And by this means, each group identified a council officer who was willing and enthusiastic in some cases to act as a champion for this issue across several departments of the council. Narrow policies. Climate policy is narrowly focused on carbon emissions and storage. So solution, community consultation was held in one borough on how to deal with climate change, and the results favored two main proposals for community food growing and rewilding, which then became a stronger basis to request support measures from council. Another problem, community food growing remains marginal to the wider food advocacy efforts around food poverty or poor diets, and thus marginal to the council's food policy. So the group would promote a food model which links all aspects, growing, distributing, cooking, eating, and so on, as a basis to liaise with diverse food groups beyond those growing food. And fragmented policies, the council's roles are fragmented across various administrative units. So the group promotes a community food model, or also known as an urban agriculture strategy, in order to promote integration of those various departments in the council. So those are just some of the ways they found to bypass or overcome the obstacles. So, conclusion, when our project began, the partner groups had been seeking support measures from the local authority, but felt discouraged by great obstacles. Through the participatory action research method, the groups regularly exchanged their experiences, while each group did its own strategic reflection, learning from the outcomes of previous efforts towards actions that could be more effective to overcome or bypass obstacles. Through this knowledge exchange across the groups, they became more self-confident about linking with other food relevant groups in their borough and engaging the local authority. These efforts have gained some improvements in council practices, as well as support from organizations beyond the council. This group learning has strengthened the collective capacities for food growing, for alliances, and advocacy for these support measures. If you want to know more, well, this PowerPoint file will be available by whatever means, and we have a blog piece with this analysis, videos from the boroughs about the borough groups about their experiences, and a council motion on the right to grow, which I mentioned near the beginning. So that's my summary of this project. Do we have Andrea now? Oh,
I can't
if
see
not,
that he's
if
here.
okay, if not, then I'll go on to the other project. To make a long story short, he is also a counselor in his borough and used that role along with the food advocacy group in our project to promote a motion on the right to grow, which was passed a few weeks ago. So now I go to the other one. So the title, Brazil's EcoSol-agroecology networks engaging local authority policies, again, through participatory action research methods. The dominant model of agricultural modernization seeks a competitive advantage in globalized food chains, especially for animal feed and ultra-processed food. This depends on resource plunder, soil degradation, high greenhouse gas emissions, and often farmers' dispossession and displacement. State and corporate structures conceive farmers as passive vehicles for technology packages, which can increase yield, make farmers more globally competitive, and so, quote, save them from backwardness. I mean, that's a sarcastic phrase from some critics of this dominant model. So this capital-intensive modernization model is often called techno-diffusionist, meaning depends on diffusing or transferring capital-intensive solutions to farmers. And this image puts together some of those packages which are ever expanding. And this agenda has shifted farmers' practices towards more complex technological tools and global market dependencies. It has also shifted agri-extension programs and official expertise to promote such practices. These pressures have devalued and marginalized traditional agricultural methods based on farmers' knowledge of local biodiverse resources. But that's just leading up to the agroecological alternatives. In the global south, small-scale peasants supply 70% of local food consumption, while using much less land than agri-industrial agriculture, which is supplying mainly the raw materials for animal feed and processed food, as I mentioned before. Most of these small-scale peasants use traditional methods which conserve bioresources and by recycling them, together minimizing environmental harm. These traditional methods have been retrospectively named agroecological in the sense that they are also amenable to improvement. How? By developing knowledge-intensive methods using locally available resources, bringing in the expertise of scientists and agronomists who have proposals for improving the methods so that this can create an agriculture which is environmentally sustainable and socioeconomically just. These practices eventually became grounded in social agrarian agendas resisting capitalist modernization, especially in Latin America, which is the focus here. The improvements have been promoted through knowledge exchange, they're called diálogo de saberes, among producers and with agricultural extensionists. Now, this poster highlights the need to valorize circuitos cortos, which is the standard phrase in Spanish or Portuguese for short supply chains. These enhance producers' livelihoods, low-cost access, and nutritional benefits to consumers. And this forms part of a much broader social movement and political agenda called Economia Solidaria, EcoSol for short. It builds democratic self-management, mutual aid, reciprocity, and cooperation, seeking to bypass dominant competitive markets. And it does through the circuitos cortos, short supply chains, bringing producers socially closer to consumers, even if they aren't geographically close. These take many forms, especially feiras de agricultura, that is, farmers' markets, and community-supported agriculture. The Economia Solidaria, or solidarity economy movement, emphasizes collective self-management of enterprises and of these secretos cortos. About, say, 2010 or so, there was a convergence of social movements for agroecology on the left, logo, and Economia Solidaria on the right, its logo. So each incorporated the other's aims. And then, and this was a further development, now going back in time, because from the 1990s onwards, there were demands from the social movements for the government to support them. And when the Partido de Trabajadores, the PT, had its presidential candidate, the winner in the 2003 election, that was Lula, it established support measures for both agroecology and Economia Solidaria. And these were designed especially to build collective capacities. And in particular, there was a solidaristic form of certification for organic products. The Agriculture Ministry authorized producers to create their own Organização de Controle Social, in Portuguese, for improving agroecological methods through knowledge exchange, eventually for self-certifying collectively the products as organic. So this provided a low-cost, socially congenial alternative to third-party certification, which is very costly and bureaucratic. I mean, that's used by the organic sector of agribusiness, but it's no use for small-scale peasants. Another support measure came to community-based tourism, which developed agroecology within a broader touristic enterprise, introducing urban visitors to those traditional forms of production and their foods. And of course, the agri-extension services then, with great difficulty, somewhat shifted away from training farmers in the capital-intensive methods towards agroecological methods. The 2003 onwards PT government also introduced or expanded these two programs, which made it an enormous material difference. One was the school meals program, there in Portuguese, whereby local authorities must source at least 30% of the food from small-scale family farmers and pay a 30% premium price for organic products. And this is why it was crucial to have that OCS scheme, a low-cost collective way to certify their products as organic. So this provided regular income for large numbers of small-scale farmers, and so provided economic viability for their agroecological methods. And at the same time, they might find other outlets, such as farmers' markets or CSE schemes. In parallel, the government expanded this program, which in English I call food consolidation for collective marketing, meaning training for small-scale producers to learn not only the agroecological production skills, but also the organizational skills, including collective self-management and strategies for appealing to consumers about the environmental and health benefits of agroecological products. Now, as the bigger political picture, right-wing parties always had a majority in the Congress, including during this PT-led government. But in that period, they accommodated the PT agenda to establish these support measures for alternatives, in parallel with even greater support for agribusiness, which is threatening the alternative. Eventually, to make a long story short, in 2016, there was a legislative coup d'etat by that right-wing majority against the PT president, Dilma Rousseff. And from then onwards, right-wing governments dismantled or degraded or reduced all the support measures for economia solidaria and agri-ecology. The training program for consolidating small-scale producers lost its federal budget, so extra training became more difficult. The school meals program had a lower budget. Nevertheless, in many localities, even in localities whose councils were dominated by right-wing parties, it only needed one or two dedicated municipal officers who wanted to continue those support measures. And there were such people, including in our case study areas. So the school meals program then was used by those officers so that municipalities could favor food supply from indigenous groups and even finance their food processing projects. And now comes our project, funded by the GCRF AHRC program beginning in early 2000. And we had a very long name, and we found a nickname, Agro-ecos. It's a kind of double pun, meaning that EcoSol initiatives have echoes being replicated across space and time. And before we knew there was going to be a pandemic, we posed this question: what collective capacities underline Secretos Cortos? How do those EcoSol-agroecology networks build such capacities? And we expected that participatory action research methods which identified and facilitate such practices in order to strengthen them. However, within a couple of months of our project beginning, there came the pandemic. And then that posed new obstacles to the Secretos Cortos, especially from the hygiene requirements. So we also asked, how do the networks overcome new obstacles and find new opportunities despite those obstacles? And our main solidarity partner in one region had already been developing this concept that the solidarity economy is an economy of proximity, meaning social proximity in many senses of the word. And the kurtos, or short, is a form of socially proximate relationships. So here you see their main conceptual framework, many kinds of societal proximity. And I skip to the final one on the side, institutional proximity, which includes interactions with professional staff and public authorities, which can provide support measures for EcoSol activities in response to their needs and demands, because that will be the focus here. The particular sub-region is called the Baixada Santista, named after the main city in the middle, with Santos, with the airport symbol. In that sub-region, there already was a Solidarity Economy Forum since around 2005, connecting artisanal activities of many kinds, including agroecology and crafts. And our main academic partner, University of Sao Paulo State, had a long-time partnership with that Solidarity Forum, which is how it became a participant in our project. Now, as in most parts of Brazil, right-wing parties dominated the state and the region. And this mattered for many reasons. You can see the sign, Fundação Instituto de Terras del Estado, which had been providing agri-extension services to agroecological farmers in order to help establish or improve those methods. In 2020, the right-wing state government announced its closure, right? So The Solidarity Forum helped to organize protests at its offices against the closure. Here's one of many demonstrations where the signs say, we demand agrarian reform and democracy. Now we move on to our specific activities. Starting March, April, we realized we had to shift our methods away from the in-person workshops that we had planned in great detail, abandon all that, and move everything online. So there began a series of rotas de conversas, or roundtables, as a tool of participatory action research. In the middle, you see Professor David Sansolo, the coordinator of the South American research teams, and the two women at the top represent the agriculture departments of two municipalities in that region, and they were among our first and foremost allies. Well, likewise, the man at the bottom, Emerson Hagaro. Now, I focus here on the town of Peruibe, which already had a local solidarity movement or network with the slogan, constructing a new reality. And the most important collective actor there is in English, the women's producers of EcoSol, which before the pandemic had been co-managing the farmers market and promoting training programs with support of municipal officers and the Agri Extension Service. Before the pandemic, because there's no face mask, but starting in March, everyone wearing the face mask, and the municipality helped this particular market to adapt to the hygiene requirements by various means. And then by around April, they'd set up a virtual fair using a combination of Facebook and WhatsApp to publicize the agroecological products of all the women, who mainly, who had been running stalls, but could no longer do so safely within the hygiene requirements, and would also provide an easier way for people to place orders. They wouldn't need to travel, and then the orders could be delivered. They also upgraded their communal kitchen to do collective production of bakery goods. I mean, this is again the women's union. And you can see most of them are not of European descent, and that's fairly typical of the solidarity economy movement. Low income, ethnic minority women. They also set up a drive-through facility at the farmers market so people could feel safer in just collecting a bag rather than walking around various stalls. Now, as regards the virus. Now, here I try to summarize how the Solidarity Forum linked the actors who were jointly extending the circuitos cortos in new ways, despite the right-wing party's control over the local government. So it linked all these actors, producers and vendors and some consumers groups, so as to structure the knowledge exchange as action research, is learning from the outcomes of their efforts to maintain or expand the circuitos cortos. So they managed to continue training programs for collective marketing, also encourage small-scale producers to barter their surplus products so that each one could sell a more diverse range of products and so appeal to more consumers, such as on that list you just saw, and develop a novel means such as the online orders and drive-through stalls. Now, of course, in this period, all the schools were closed, but the funds were still available for the school meals program. So civil society groups, including the Forum, demanded that local authorities expand the provision to vulnerable or needy families. And they raised the slogan, "This is solidarity, not charity," in order to avoid any feelings of shame about accepting, say, food baskets through that system. Moreover, the municipalities set up advisory panels on the EcoSol, solidarity economy, to discuss what would be more helpful support measures. And these panels, including representatives of the Solidarity Forum, especially the Women's Union, who effectively became like active citizen representatives, which was a novelty for their roles, relative to their previous roles. And that illustrates a more general social movement of women's organizations throughout Brazil, and including in this area, whereby women's leadership, known as protagonismo feminino or feminista, as a more political phrase, strengthen their capacities, highlight their economic contribution to their families and to local commerce, and so can help overcome gender inequalities. Moreover, as we found out eventually, various friendship networks had found out about these initiatives and were replicating them or joining them by setting up their own collective marketing. And the other way around, some low-income groups in the peripheries of cities, which were like food deserts, established consumer cooperatives for collectively purchasing organic food from particular producers. So conclusion, return to the questions at the beginning. How did these networks build collective capacities? Well, some answers. EcoSol-agroecology networks expanded circuitos cortos by activating and linking various societal proximities, including the focus here, institutional proximity with local authorities, meanwhile developing collective capacities for them. And here institutional proximity means shaping or gaining support measures from state bodies. The network strengthens solidaristic bonds among various artisanal activities, including agroecological production. Participatory action research was developed so that practitioners could test their strategies for adapting to the pandemic, that is, hygiene restriction, to evaluate the outcomes, to build collective capacities, exchange knowledge, and engage with the local authority officers. The webinars help spread the practices throughout the region as well as to other parts of the country. There were analogous webinars eventually being held in other parts of the country, perhaps stimulated by ours. So all this illustrates the nickname we gave our project before the pandemic, agri-ecos, meaning that EcoSol initiatives have echoes being replicated across space and time. If you want to know more, we have several outputs here on the final slide, including a film about those developments in the Baixada Santista. So I conclude there.
I will say a few words by
Okay.
means of maybe starting up the discussion,
Mhm.
and then we will turn over to colleagues who might have questions or might have their own experiences with these types of methodologies, and perhaps would want to share some of their projects. Les has helpfully sort of outlined a few questions for people to think about, who might be participating in the seminar, around methods and how they might have used them and what their experiences might have been with local authorities and with other governmental and non-governmental organizations. So if you've had those kinds of experiences and would like to share them, that would be great. So thank you again, Les. Really fascinating set of projects, and fascinating presentation. I had the opportunity to look at it before, and so also the opportunity to look at a few of the outputs, which are great. So I would encourage all of you to also have a click through some of the outputs on the projects, the films and blogs and other things, as it really gives you kind of a sense of how the projects have worked and the impact that they had really. So just a few kind of provocations, I guess, when we think about participatory action research and these kinds of projects. The first one is around the methodology itself, and the knowledge that it generates. So if you kind of look at some of the older literature on participatory action research, a lot of the critique focuses on sort of a very positivist approach to science, a very narrow understanding of what kinds of knowledges are legitimate, who produces those kinds of knowledges, how are they produced. So that might not be as relevant of a discussion point for us here, as I think by looking at the list of colleagues who are in the room, I imagine that many of us don't subscribe to those kinds of very positivist understandings of science and of knowledge production, but it still might be worth reflecting on a little bit, particularly as this project and these kinds of projects often aim to work with governments, to work with local authorities, to work with counselors, and of course to work with funders, who quite often might have different understandings of evidence, of what research is, of the distinction between research and engagement, between research and skills building, and so on. So just something to flag. I mean, I note from your presentation that you had quite a sympathetic counselor on one of your projects, who was also your project co-author. But I wonder if you know, if there were less sympathetic counselors or stakeholders who did kind of you know, who saw as problematic the kind of blurring of lines between, for instance, skills building and research, or the kinds of evidence that you're presenting, or the kind of long-term cycle that I think this kind of research requires, that's often not understood, I think, very well by funders in particular. So that's one kind of provocation to put out there. The second thing I wanted us maybe as a group to think about is the kind of investment, and I don't mean financial in this particular case, that this type of research requires from researchers, but also from participants. So it's quite demanding, I think, to be part of this kind of participatory research action cycle that you've presented at the beginning of your participation. I'm sure it's very rewarding, but it is also quite time consuming, and you know, requiring a lot of time brings with it sort of questions of access, and of how self-selecting these groups are, how much, you know, they actually get out of it versus how much they put in. And so I think that's something that it would be great if you and maybe other colleagues who've had experiences with these kinds of methods could reflect a little bit about, because there is the question of, you know, how self-selecting are the kinds of groups that you're involved in, what kinds of people do they involve, and how accessible are they to different groups to participate in with the kind of intensity that is required of these types of methods. And again, you know, on the question of intensity, you've talked about echoes and kind of replicating these things and spreading them throughout various networks. So that's a third kind of provocation, is what is kind of the best way of doing that, and how do we know that these kinds of things, you know, do actually sort of become it becomes possible to kind of scale them up and to kind of filter them out, and how long does that last? So I've been part of some of these types of projects, where, you know, over the course of the project, things get set up. You know, perhaps, you know, the project finishes and things keep going for a little bit longer, but then when, you know, then it kind of peters out a little bit. People lose interest, they don't have time, they lose funding. You know, how do you keep these kinds of things going? Because they are, you know, I can see from what you've presented, quite life altering in many instances. So how do you scale these up? How do you make sure that they maintain their momentum, that, you know, that they build on the gains that you have made? And I guess the last kind of question or provocation is how can we think about, you know, what can we learn from particularly this project in South America for us here? And is it in some ways perhaps an extension or can we think about it as an extension of what you've done with sort of local authorities in the first project that you've mentioned? So I was thinking as you were speaking, how viable would it be, for instance, to think about, these kinds of measures, for instance, for school lunches, to create kind of shorter circuits of supply. So, would it be possible to convince someone somewhere? And I think that's part of the other question is, how do you find these people that you can kind of pressurize and convince to source, for instance, school meals here from kind of local farmers or from these sort of urban growers? Would that be possible? How would you kind of go about doing something like that? And what can we learn in that sense from that project that might be kind of applicable in a very different context that we have here with a very different, obviously, government structure and a very different government and so on. So I think I'll stop there. And, as I said, these are kind of more sort of things to think about and perhaps provocations than anything else that you might want to speak to, or maybe someone else in the audience might want to speak to. So I'll perhaps turn to you first if you want to respond to any of those, and then to others if they want to respond to that, or if they want to kind of share any of their own experiences with these kinds of methods and projects.
Yeah, perhaps I'll speak just to a couple of those points because to respond to them all would use up the rest of the time. So, yeah, how to set up, or how do people set up such a project in the first place, with some commitment from particular collective actors who want to participate? It always depends on a key individual or two in an organization to see the point of it. How might this benefit them? And often it depends on already having some familiarity with the people making the proposal, or some indirect connection to such a person, and some sense that they they need a more rigorous approach to achieve their aims. And participatory action research might just help. And when we were setting up the project on, say, borough-wide advocacy groups in southern England, as it happens, we already had connections. That is, between I and Andrea together had strong connections to, say, two or three groups from a previous project, the EHRC project, on how community gardens responded to the pandemic. But then had to extend that to 5, which would be the ideal number. And we had the funding for it from the Open Societal Challenges program. But we really had to search and persuade key individuals in organizations to take on such a commitment, because it does involve considerable time. I mean, not mainly the 2-hour meeting once a month, mainly everything that happens in between, like keeping a diary, or a reflective diary, as we call it, holding far more discussions than they would otherwise do with colleagues, with counselors. Some of them had no connection at all to the local authority, but wanted to do so. Others had long time negative experiences and even despair in dealing with the local authority. So each for their own reasons, they all had some sense of reluctance to enter into a project whose focus was, engaging local authorities. But I suppose they also recognized that the discussion among the borough-wide groups would be an opportunity to reflect on their experiences and try to be more effective. And eventually we did find 5, and they were very happy they did so. And about halfway through the project, we devoted one session to reflect on the methods themselves. And it was the first time any of them had used that kind of structure. And they all said more or less, well, intuitively, we had been doing something like that to strengthen our intervention strategies, but this gave a clear structure for doing so. and especially in exchanging knowledge with the other groups doing so within the project. And that means they were all self-selected, more or less, for people who had that vision of a stronger strategy to be more effective and to be developed collectively. And of course, each of the five had a very different context in many senses of the word context, but they all had in common this interest in a collective learning process to make the best of, well, the adverse circumstances and to recognize whatever opportunities there might be. I mean, in the South American project, well, there's some analogy in that, again, the EcoSol groups already knew the UNESCO coordinator of the South American groups, and that helped. But he needed many discussions. Well, they needed many discussions to be persuaded to enter into such a commitment. I mean, not a contractual one, but a mindset that they would participate. And of course, no one knew then there was going to be the pandemic. And then they were doubly glad they had agreed to it because it gave an opportunity for structuring discussions and reaching analogous initiatives in other parts of the country through the webinars. On your other point about, or question about dealing with local authorities, this was a new experience for me. And just to take each in turn, I mean, we knew about the adverse circumstances of the Brazilian federal government, the state government, all run by right-wing parties. Well, the presidency run by fascist Bolsonaro. But we also knew there were supportive officers in local authorities who wanted to help and creatively found ways to help with modest budgets. And it's mainly by mobilizing goodwill plus small amounts of money in those budgets which are still available, or budgets from international foundations. So they did make a positive difference. And as likewise, some local authority officers in many places that had hostile political parties running the overall local government. In in Britain, it was more subtle and varied across the five boroughs. Firstly, we had to understand what's the source of these obstacles, many different kinds of obstacles. And to some extent, I had an intuition. This was really the legacy of new public management. And I quickly then did a literature survey and brought those concepts into the discussions that since the 90s, local governments have incorporated those basic neoliberal norms of fragmenting the roles into ever more smaller units, adopting performance criteria that would do only what could be measured, and hence the practice of delivering things and quantifying the things as the achievement. But and that was true in some boroughs. In some boroughs, there was hardly any support of any kind, in not even delivering things. And the land was a pervasive problem. And again, this is from the neoliberal agenda of financializing land. I mean, especially in a place like central Reading, but also in other places where the authority wanted to leave open its options for lucrative developments. So most of the land that was accessed during the project came from organizations other than the local authority, which perhaps had different norms of more social benefit, or public assets is the key concept there. And another key concept is co-producing services or collaboratively producing services. Because the more recent literature on new public management contrasts that with a more recent model, which has been elaborated since around the turn of the century, that they call co-production, which of course can have many meanings, but it means collaboratively between the service users and service providers. So I also brought this into the monthly discussions as a positive model, which resonated with some of them and helped them to formulate what they were trying to do, or how they were trying to identify local authority officers who wanted a collaborative relationship. And that did happen in some councils more than others. And it only needed one or two council officers
Okay.
to try to develop such a mode. So I'll stop there.